Okay, so everybody's filtering back in, and really great presentation so far. I just wanted to take a minute before we jump into this presentation. Nick Del Rosso earlier, I guess the running gag at DIBCAC is to say we're not contract officers. We sort of set him up because tomorrow Andriani Buck will be here for an hour of Q&A, and she was a DoD contract officer for 8 years. Recently left being a contract officer. So all of those questions that DIBCAC tries to keep at an arm's length should be good questions for her. So we'll keep that in mind. And then as we get through this presentation, there will be several ideas that really sort of queue up and should prompt good questions to think about for some of the additional sessions that we'll have throughout the event. Okay, so for this presentation, it started about 6 months ago. Several of you in the room have watched my slow decline mentally, trying to figure out what's going on with the upcoming rule that DoD is supposed to release for CMMC. About a year and a half ago, we released a really long video that traced the timeline of rulemaking that DoD has gone through. But it didn't really dive into the substance of the rules. So the idea was we were going to go through and read all 850 comments that were submitted on the interim rule in 2020, and then compare that to the comments that were submitted on previous rules in order to try to predict what the DoD will say. And we did that. We read all of the comments, every word of every comment. And what I thought was going to happen was we were going to have this big cinematic sort of lengthy walkabout through the democratic process of all of the inputs that the public gave the government, and they've been spending months and months reviewing. And as many of you have seen, I have been not able to do that because the same theme kept popping up over and over and over again in rulemaking, in terms of the comments that were submitted. And that one theme can basically be summed up with this comment. I know it's lengthy, but I want to take a second so that everybody can read it. So comments were submitted to the 2020 interim rule. A lot of the comments make points that you've probably heard. What year do you think this comment, it's a real comment, was submitted to the DFARS cybersecurity rulemaking process? We'll take just a second to read it. Real comment. Now, if anybody saw this poll 6 months ago on LinkedIn, don't answer, right? Don't tell everybody. Let them experience the magic for the first time. And if you can tell by my sarcasm, it's a trick question, right? Who thinks this was submitted in 2020 on the current interim rule, right? Yeah, obviously it's a trap, right? It was not submitted. It was submitted on the 2016 rule, which revised DFARS 7012 into the form that we know it today. But do these points sound familiar to you, right? It sounds like it could be submitted in 2020. And in fact, the real answer is that in spirit, this comment specifically has been submitted to every rule, all 3 rules that have gone into the rulemaking process. And as part of the rulemaking process, the government has to respond to those comments. But we keep getting the same comments. And I think that the disparity is we don't know what their responses were because they're sort of buried into a weird document as part of the rulemaking process. And outside of the timeline video that we did a while ago, we don't really get that response from the government when they give webinars, when they're up on stage, when they're doing interviews and things like that. So it's quite obscure what their actual responses are. Now, in addition to that, one of the very strange behaviors that we've noticed while we're analyzing all of this rulemaking is that people keep saying, we're going to wait for the rule to be done to get started, or we're going to wait and see what the rule is going to say before we believe that CMMC is a real thing. And it's very odd to me that people would use rulemaking to justify their hesitancy when a rule that has specified the requirements that you're supposed to be implementing is already done, right? You see the contradiction? You're using rulemaking to say, I'm not going to do something, but if you take a closer look at rulemaking, if the rule's already done, then you have all the information that you need. So something's going on here that's causing this gap in people's understanding. And because we have folks from the DoD tomorrow, we have folks from NIST who are going to be discussing 800-171 specifically, we have contract officer, we have all this information flowing around, not only in this event, but increasingly as we go forward in the rulemaking process. Sort of the real goal of this presentation is to drive a single point home. There is a difference between the CMMC program from a rulemaking perspective and the requirements that the CMMC program assesses from a rulemaking perspective. They are the product of two separate rulemaking timelines, two separate rulemaking events. And so if we are submitting comments that have already been answered, one, we can predict what the rule will say, but we can also sort of make better sense of a lot of the information that's being put out about CMMC. So by having this better understanding, it will equip anybody to be able to evaluate interviewers or presenters or LinkedIn posters or whoever's talking about CMMC. If we have this more granular understanding, you can better evaluate what they're saying. And that's really the goal. Okay, so in order to do that, we're going to run very quickly through the basics of rulemaking. There's a lot of very interesting scholarly work that explains it in more detail, but we're just going to hit the highlights to get everybody on the same page. That will allow us to understand the relationship between the program and the requirements. Then we'll be able to look at the similarity of comments that were submitted across different cybersecurity rulemaking efforts over the years. And that will allow us to sort of understand why there's so much confusion and hopefully avoid it in the future so we can have better and more productive conversations around CMMC. And hopefully companies will understand that this process is, when you look closer at it, really inevitable as you take a closer look at the rulemaking. Okay, so rulemaking basics very quickly. There's a lot of text on some of these slides, so they're available, and you should probably take a glance at them and read them later on. We're just going to hit the highlights. So a rule is a regulation. Everybody sort of has heard the term regulation. Rule is just a word for regulation. Rulemaking is the process of creating government regulations. So rulemaking can be sort of triggered in multiple ways. Bob was talking about this earlier. It can be kicked off via legislation, like the NDAA, which is the common cause of a lot of DFARS rulemaking. It can be kicked off through executive orders, such as the CUI. Man, I can't turn my head that way because this mic is super hot. Okay, so it can be triggered via executive orders, such as the Obama executive order that kicked off the CUI program, which caused rulemaking to happen, or the Biden executive order on software security, which triggered a bunch of rulemaking and will continue to trigger lots of rulemaking. It can also be started via agency authority, which is a little bit more obscure, but it can start in many ways. Okay, so on our event guide, there is a link to this document, and this document is outstanding if you want to know more about the specific steps and phases of rulemaking. The rulemaking process is the same for all agencies. It's going to always follow the same steps. It's always going to contain the same elements and activities, although it will sometimes happen in a slightly different order. The ones that you've probably heard of are a proposed rule at step 3, being further to the left, or an interim final rule, which gets to start further to the right. The only difference being the sequence of activities. It explains it in more detail. This document's like 19 pages long. Something to know about the rulemaking process is that it is extremely powerful, and over decades in many administrations, the government has tried to wrestle more control around the rulemaking process. And this has sort of weighed down the process in numerous complex analyses and red tape and sort of bureaucratic sausage making that the rules have to go through. One of the reasons why there is such a gap between the DoD submitting their final CMMC rule like today, next week, I think, Stacy will be here tomorrow to give us the update, and not knowing what the rule says until the spring is because of these reviews. Now, it's important to know that if they're submitting the rule today and we don't get to see it until the spring, they submit it because it will be approved, not because the rule is changing. So when Stacy's on this stage tomorrow, she knows what the rule says. She knows what the responses to your comments are, but she can't tell you legally because it's policy, right? You have to wait for the rulemaking process to play out. And that should start to make you feel very uncomfortable if you think, I'm gonna wait to see what the rule says because I don't have my hands tied. I'm not a DoD employee. All of this material is publicly available, and we can just put our thinking hat on and anticipate what the rule is going to say. The delay is not a function of the rule continuing to change. This is a very common perception. The delay is strictly a function of these checks and processes that are outlined in the document. You should read it to get more familiar with them. Okay, so regulations are codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. If you want to know what the EPA and the FAA and all of the other executive agencies are up to, you can go to the ECFR and you can read them because they're all documented there. At the end of the rulemaking process, they get codified and documented in the CFR for everybody to read. The ones that we're most familiar with would be Title 48 out of the 50 titles. Title 48 is the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Subsequent to that is the DFARS. All of the agencies have their own supplement to the FAR for their specific acquisition rules. There's an excellent book by my friend Christoph called The FAR in Plain English. Highly recommend you read it. He does a very good job, I think he's a contracts lawyer, of explaining what the FAR is and how it functions. If you're just sort of sub-point here, if you're curious as to why we're constantly referring to these requirements as DFARS 252, 204, something, 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 these like weird cryptic numbers, it is because of its location in the FAR. Like the reason why we use these bizarre codes to talk to each other is because of where it sits in the FAR. That's the whole reason. Okay, the most magical part of this entire process is that everything is documented in the Federal Register for you to read now online. This is actually historically a pretty revolutionary idea. You can see what's going on with this rulemaking process. The reason why the Federal Register is so important, and some of us were talking about this earlier, is if you only read the regulations as they are documented in the Code of Federal Regulations, you only get the final output. You only get the what of the regulation. If you want to know why a regulation is written the way it is, why it did or did not change, if you want to understand the rationale of the government, you need to read their responses to the public comment process, and the only place you can find that is documented in the Federal Register. This is updated every day. It's updated every day. It's what is this? Since '94, almost 900,000 documents. The beating heart of government regulation is documented and updated online for anybody to read all day long. I mean, basically, a lot of the rulemaking talks that I give are just book reports. So, basics of rulemaking. So the mental model of understanding the distinction between the CMMC program and the underlying requirements, in my opinion, is the most powerful way to make sense of the debate and the disharmony and the disinformation around CMMC that's been flying around for years. So, at the heart of all of this rulemaking that has occurred over the years is the document NIST SP 800-171, the requirements in NIST SP 800-171. Say what you will about it, right? When Bob was up here earlier, that is at the core of what we're doing because these rulemaking processes incorporate that document by reference, right? So if you think about what CMMC is doing, and we'll see the details here in a moment, what is CMMC doing? Is it creating requirements or is it assessing requirements? Right? Now, we'll talk about why this is so confusing. The DoD, for some reason, decided to confuse everybody and pretend like they were making requirements and then reverse the decision and blah, blah, blah. I mean, we should be 2 years ahead of where we are because of that decision, but CMMC assesses those requirements. 7019 and 7020 are forms of assessment of the requirements in 171, right? 32 CFR, the document that specifies the overall government-wide CUI program, incorporates 800-171 by reference. It is not actually creating the requirements. DFARS 7008, which is the really spicy one that you should read, because that's the one when you accept it, you've self-attested. If I'm right, Stephanie, you can probably let us know later. DFARS 7012, everybody's familiar with, incorporated by reference, right? None of these rulemaking processes are actually the ones that are generating those requirements. Who generates NIST requirements? It's NIST. It's NIST. Yet the entire debate around CMMC is around problems stemming from the NIST requirements. We're yelling at the people writing the regulations, even though they are required to incorporate them by reference, as if they have some control over what those requirements are, right? You can sort of see where we're going here. Okay, so rule summaries are printed in the Federal Register at the very top. The rules are very long, but just read the summary of the rule and it will tell you what the rule is doing. Now it's sort of in strange, it's written in a specific sort of government tone, but it is relatively efficient, right? So if we look at 32 CFR section 2002 or part 2002, which governs the CUI program, this is the government-wide CUI program, it tells you in the summary exactly what the rule is doing. Now, when they respond to comments, this is back in 2016, to the overall CUI program, they got exactly what we're seeing with CMMC. People saying it's expensive, and it's difficult, and it's complex, and it's impactful to small business, and it's impactful to universities, and it creates barriers to entry, and none of it makes sense, and this is dumb and stinky, and I don't like it. All right? There's all sorts of comments that get submitted. We read all of them. There's all kinds of comments that get submitted. And the government responds and they say most of the comments on the burden and time required to implement these requirements don't stem from this rule, the rule that creates the government-wide CUI program. They come from the burden of the recently, at the time, published 800-171. And then they go on at length to say, if you have a problem with 800-171, go talk to the people who wrote FSMA, right? Because it is derived from FSMA. We're over here telling you and just sort of doing our job and following orders, right? The problems with 171 are not associated with the programs that have been created by rulemaking. So if we look at the summaries of the individual DFARS rules over the years, we can see where the DFARS rules specify the 800-171 requirements. So the very first edition of DFARS 7012 was created in 2013. And originally it pointed to 853 as the set of requirements because 800-171 didn't exist yet. And in the summary, DoD says, we're issuing a rule, amending the DFARS, we're adding something to the DFARS, we're adding a subpart and associated clauses, which are the part we're familiar with, for the requirements for safeguarding unclassified controlled technical information. They didn't even have a phrase for CUI at the time. So this is where they point to the requirements first. Years go by, bad stuff happens, and then all of a sudden we get another rulemaking event. And the summary tells us we're adopting a rule, amending the DFARS, implementing pieces of legislation. We've been directed by legislation to do a thing which can trigger rulemaking, as well as DoD's policy on acquiring cloud services and agency authority to modify what's going on in the requirements that we already created with the rule in 2013. So the 2013 rule points to the requirements. The 2016 rule revises those requirements. It's actually a typo. It should say 2015 to 2016. We'll get it fixed. We'll fix it in post, right? And so we're still pointing by reference. When we get to 2020, and then we see the CMMC rule, in the summary, it says we're issuing a rule to implement the methods for DoD assessment and for CMMC in order to assess implementation of the requirements that are incorporated by previous rules. So when you get comments on the 2020 rule that have issues with the requirements specified by other clauses, what do you want these rulemaking authors to do about it? And Stacy, which, I mean, she has to give a lot of webinars, right? She had a break in 2021 when the DoD basically just took the year off and stopped talking to everybody. But she's been giving a lot of webinars since February. And she said this once, and I would like her to open with this tomorrow. So we'll see if she says it. NIST SP 800-171 is not a part of the discussion as far as the rulemaking is concerned with the CMMC program. We all know that's the requirement, and you have to comply. That's not going to change. So when you hear comments, when you hear arguments, when you hear criticisms about CMMC, the question to ask yourself is, are they talking about the CMMC assessment program, the steps and phases and process of going through an assessment, or are they talking about issues that stem from the requirements themselves? Because even though those criticisms of the requirements are legitimate, they are true, it is expensive, it is complex, it is difficult, it's overly narrow, right? It doesn't help us with things that we needed to help with, it's out of date, blah, blah, blah. That's all true. And it has nothing to do with CMMC. So, the comments. There are a lot of comments submitted on the interim rule. Now, I know it's very small, so feel free to reference it from the event guide, but if you look at the rule from 2013 and you look at the rule from 2016, the government takes all of the comments that were submitted to those rules and categorizes them sort of by common theme. And so if you sort of look at what they're talking about in this section, which is the form that the final rule takes, you can kind of see that they categorize things based off specifics. For instance, when the rule was created that said you have to do more incident reporting, there were lots of comments and questions about what are you going to do with my data? And what are the specifics of incident reporting? Not things to do with the cost and burden and complexity of the requirements incorporated by reference. Issues specifically pertaining to business impact, barriers to entry, are actually a part of some specific analyses and checks that the government has to go through. Remember, we talked about this process of slowing down rulemaking because there has to be specific reviews and requirements. So you can kind of see, if you read these a little bit closer later on and think about the types of comments that you've heard sort of levied against CMMC, what the structure of the final rule will start to take, right? There's going to be a lot of the questions that will be answered by the CAP, hopefully, which Joy tomorrow will be giving us, hopefully some details on, should be released any day. The structure and process of how an assessment will work operationally are probably going to be some of the specific things that they address in the structure of the final rule. And so the cost and burden, small business impact, all those issues that stem from the requirements rather than the CMMC program are sort of summed up on this chart. The references are at the end of the deck. Across all the rulemaking efforts that have occurred so far, you see the same answers. Who likes hearing that costs are allowable? Right? What's the most annoying thing that you can tell a DoD contractor these days? You should have already been doing it, right? And so those answers show up again and again and again. So if you don't want to go read the comments, check this chart. You can click the link in the back of the deck and it will take you to their answer, whether you want the 2013 version, you want the 2016 version, or you want to see what the 2020 version will probably say, because they are all a function of the same criticisms and comments that have been submitted. So when the final rule comes out, if you don't go off and read the rules, which who does that, right? When the final rule comes out in 2023, probably, the section that I would encourage everybody to scroll to is something called the Regulatory Flexibility Analysis. The Regulatory Flexibility Act is one of these processes that you have to go through in order to conduct rulemaking, and it's designed to evaluate the costs and benefits and trade-offs when you impact small businesses with a government regulation. Right? That's exactly what everybody's worried about. Small business issues, you're harming innovation, all the valid arguments. And so they will start out and they will say the objective of this rule, which is a little bit different than the summary of the rule at the front, is so on and so forth. And however, the benefit of doing this is the following. And if you look at what they've said in their regulatory flexibility analysis for the previous rules, you get these answers. All the answers we hate. Right? Yes, it impacts small businesses. Yes, it's expensive, but the costs are allowable. Yes, there are side effects and trade-offs of actually turning the screws and making people implement these requirements. But we've determined that those are okay, and we did our analysis under the Regulatory Flexibility Act, and them's the breaks. So when we get to the 2020 rule, what are they going to say? Probably a lot of the same things that we've heard here, and we know that that's true because the DoD is already telegraphing their answers via their webinars. So there are limits, so don't beat her up too bad tomorrow. There are limits to what Stacy can actually give a specific answer to, right? There are limits to what she can say, but you will hear her say this when she's on stage tomorrow. You've heard it before. It's the same webinar she's been giving for, since the beginning of the year. The costs are allowable. You should have been doing it already, right? These are not our requirements. That has something to do with NIST. Okay, so in the 2020 rule, in the current DFARS case, they explain this even further. They actually preempt their regulatory flexibility analysis. You can see where they're going already. They say this rule validates and verifies compliance with existing requirements, right, from the other rules that are incorporating 171 by reference, and the estimated costs that everybody brings up of this rule do not include the costs associated with the compliance of the you should have been doing it already. The costs are allowable. It's already represented by your rate. Should have been implemented is a phrase that the DoD put into their interim rule 7 times, right? So it doesn't really matter which person from DoD is up here saying these answers, right? This is the policy of the agency overall. Okay. So there's a ton of confusion. There's like obviously a massive disparity here between the comments that we're submitting and the answers that we're getting. We've done it 3 times now. You guys know that saying, if you do the same thing, what is it? You're insane if you do something more than, what is it? What's the phrase? Well, it's funny that everyone in the crowd knows what it is, right? Does it feel a little close to home that we've done it a 3rd time in a row? In geometry, it takes 2 points on a plane to draw a line, right? We've got 2 points in the rulemaking process with the same comments, the same responses. We've got the same comments. We're going to get the same responses, right? But why is there so much confusion? In my opinion, there's 3 reasons why there's so much confusion. And I think if we understand it better, it will sort of, well, I don't know if it'll be therapeutic or cathartic or not, but it'll at least be clarifying. So the CMMC assessment requirements were a surprise for most people, right? We know that the rules existed beforehand. We know the story, right? And everybody got caught flat-footed for many reasons. The second reason is that the DoD, I will never forgive them for doing this, relabeled the existing requirements as if they were new for no reason, seemingly, other than, I don't know what the reason they thought it was going to do, but really all it did was just confuse everyone. And then what I call the great silence of 2021, right? Where they just stopped talking to everybody. They didn't do interviews. They had a gag order at the Pentagon while they did their internal Pentagon review. They just stopped talking to everybody. And what did that do? Everybody immediately said, oh, well, I guess it went away, right? Even though the rules that establish the requirements were already done, right? That's what the meme at the beginning was talking about. So you may have seen this chart before. The Federal Register is like a GeoCities website or Angel Fire back in the day. There's a view count on the Federal Register webpage. It's great, right? So it'll tell you how many view counts they have. A significant number of these are probably mine, but it's still illustrative to say that no one reads rules, right? This is a public webpage. Bots don't even read them. But then as soon as the rule came out that said, we're going to come assess you, and if you don't get the certification, that's it, everybody started paying attention, right? So it makes sense why people were caught off guard. You know, there's many reasons that we've talked about at CS2 presentations before. It's not incentivized. People didn't ask about it. Lowest price technically acceptable. There's all these macro forces that have influenced the ecosystem to not really care about these issues. But just because you're in the dark blue column doesn't mean that everything that happened beforehand isn't true. Regulatory flexibility analysis, the comments and responses, so on and so forth. Okay, the relabeling of the requirements. So as if relabeling the existing NIST SP 800-171 requirements wasn't bad enough, right? Everybody was like, what are you doing? We got this monstrosity at the end under CMMC 2.0, where they just mashed both of them together, which I guess is fine because you can actually see that CMMC is incorporating the NIST requirements specifically. It's in the title of the CMMC control. Functionally, this is better because you can say, no, it's not actually new. It's literally in the label. Now, when they published the rule, they didn't do that. They just called it AC.1.001. This is worse than talking to each other with DFARS clause numbers, right? I mean, you sound like a crazy person if you are. Is that a Ring doorbell? So, right, they relabeled these requirements. And honestly, I think because of this issue, this is the #1 thing that understandably confused everybody. If nobody knew about what was going on until we saw this big spike in traffic, and then all of a sudden you have this weird cryptic title, and then somebody like me gets on stage and goes, you should have been doing it all along. Did you know about one? They're like, what are you talking about? This is ridiculous. They made it as difficult as possible to explain that it actually should have been happening all along. And then the great silence of 2021 kicks in because everybody freaks out whenever they release the rule and they say, we're going to come and assess you. And there's all these new requirements that are not actually new and blah, blah, blah. And there's congressional testimony and there's just all this consternation flying around. So they stop talking. They stop talking about the rule. They stop talking about CMMC. And what do? Interestingly, they take the comments from the rule as an input into this review process. It's a review that took like 9 or 10 months. I think it went March to November, right? So they spend all this time reviewing the comments, reviewing the inputs that people submitted, which are really criticisms of 800.171, right? A lot of people took that to say, it's going away. There's a lot of confirmation bias flying around, even though the pre-existing rules existed. And then we got to this chart, which you may have seen before. The takeaway from this chart, if you read it a little, if you decide to read it more closely later on, the main takeaway is that the comments submitted to the 2020 interim rule were an input to the Pentagon's review, and the output of that review was CMMC 2.0. Does CMMC 2.0 fix the comment issue, the issues that the comments brought up? Like, does it quell the concerns of industry? There were 850 of these comments, right? Now, you can probably tell if the comments were the same, and there were 850 on this rule, and there were like 50 on a previous rule. What we noticed when we read all of the comments is that there are many, many more comments on the 2020 rule, but there are not many, many different comments on the rule. They are fundamentally the same. So CMMC 2.0 was the output of that review process. Who thinks that CMMC 2.0 fixed the issues brought up by the comments? Anybody? Right? We're still saying the same things. The cost and the burden and the impact. What are you going to do? And there's congressional testimony, and they made DoD go assess themselves against 800.171. Did everybody catch that when that happened? The report that came out? Is Nick Del Rosso still here? I don't know if he's still here. Does anybody know what the average percentage of compliance is when DBCAC goes and does an assessment, or an industry report comes out, like the level of implementation, what percentage? It's like 30%, right? It's like 28, 30%. Does anybody know what the percentage implementation within the DoD of 800.171 was? It's a lot more than 30%. It's like 80%. Did you guys chuckle because you thought I was going to give you a low number? Right? Their implementation rate is much, much better than the DIBS is. So we sort of stepped in it by asking them to go assess themselves. That actually backfired, but we don't really talk about that GAO report a lot. Okay, so 2.0 is the output of the review process. So there's a lot of things that came out of the review process, and we don't really talk about them. Hopefully Stacy will go into some more details tomorrow. So just to sort of set the stage, pre-existing rules, 2016 and before, specify the requirements. The 2020 rule assesses those requirements. Everybody doesn't like it. We circle the wagons and we stop talking through all of 2021. We do the Pentagon review, we read the comments, we come out with 2.0 as the calibration. The DoD has said that they have split the 2020 interim rule into 2 final rules. You can actually find this documented in something called the Unified Agenda, which is another one of these processes that the government has to go through in order to release a rule, right? Twice a year, all the agencies have to inform the White House and OMB of all their plans for rulemaking. So they took the rule and they've split it in 2, which makes sense because the 2020 interim rule really asks us to do 2 things: the DoD assessment methodology and the CMMC assessment methodology. So the DoD assessment methodology part of the rule doesn't specify requirements, it specifies an assessment method. So all of the comments that are saying I have a problem with the requirements are not relevant to that rule. They're saying that they're going to release that part of the rule in like December of this year. So the contract clause 7019 and 7020, that's what that rule will codify into the Federal Register. The rule that specifies DFARS 7021, that contract clause will be its own rule, which makes sense because we really had two things bolted together in the interim rule. But again, it is assessing specific requirements in 800-171, so criticisms levied against CMMC that are actually relevant to the requirements won't be addressed in a meaningful way whenever the rule gets published. Right? Now, the big news here is that after the rule, they decided to split it in two. Splitting rules is not uncommon through rulemaking. This happens all the time. But there is now a second CMMC rule. And this rule is going to codify the CMMC program at a different part of the Code of Federal Regulations. So remember when we talked about before, there's all these titles in the Code of Federal Regulations. And most of what we talk about is Title 48, which is specifying contract clauses to go do a thing, right? Comply, go get a certification, this and that. The DoD has said, after our review, after reading the comments, after hearing what everybody's saying for a third time about the cost and the burden and the impact of CMMC, we're not only going to make it a contract clause, still afterwards, we are going to take the elements of the CMMC program and codify it at 32 CFR. Does anybody know what programs are codified at 32 CFR? This is the DoD's part of the Code of Federal Regulations. What are some like DoD-wide programs? The VA, the GI Bill, right? These are DoD-wide, Pentagon-level programs that are in the Code of Federal Regulations. And now CMMC is going to be right there next to them. So when you sort of understand what the Code of Federal Regulations represents, and you hear somebody say, I don't think the government is taking CMMC seriously anymore, what part about this sequence of events would give you the basis for that opinion? That they took a while? That they like stopped talking for 9 months? People have sort of reached the conclusion that CMMC is going away or evaporating or becoming something less, and I don't know where they're getting that determination from, because if you read the comment responses and you read some of the other analyses that say this is what we're doing with rulemaking, you would logically conclude that the exact opposite is happening. They stopped for 9 months and they have now elevated CMMC even higher than it was before. There was no 32 CFR rulemaking in the 2020 interim rule. There is now after the interim or after the Pentagon review. So in that sense, CMMC now is more real than it ever was before. Yet there are more people than ever saying, I don't really know, right? Very precarious situation to be in. And like we said before, you can go onto eCFR, look up these titles in Title 32 and Title 48, compare and contrast. Very, very interesting that they are working CMMC into Title 32, something that I hope Stacy expands upon when she's here tomorrow. Okay, so the key takeaway behind all of this is that the program and the requirements which the program assesses are different. They are the function of different rulemaking events, right? And the common theme here is that the consternation around the program is actually criticisms of the requirements. Luckily, Victoria Pelletieri will be here tomorrow, and I'm sure she's very interested to hear your criticisms of the requirements, because like Bob was saying, NIST is asking for people's input. Now, NIST doesn't go through this sort of actual rulemaking process in the Federal Register when they create their special publications, but they still receive comments, right? They still take them on board. We submitted all the comments that should have gone to NIST onto the interim rule. And we sort of used that confusion between these two ideas to create a lot of disinformation that CMMC is stopping or slowing down or changing, and that's not true. So now that you sort of have a better understanding of what's going on, anytime you hear somebody saying it's going away or it's changing or it's modifying, or I don't think they're taking it seriously, or there's no way that they will possibly let CMMC happen because it's expensive, or it's a burden, or it's a barrier, or you know all the arguments, ask yourself, is this person talking about the CMMC program, or are they talking about the NIST requirements? Usually, they're not talking about an element of the CMMC program. And sort of to illustrate this, let's do a little thought experiment. So everybody knows CMMC is very expensive. Let's say that, well, let's back up real quick. CMMC is very expensive because an assessment costs money, right? An assessment costs time, which is money, right? There is a cost associated with the program, but the costs of the requirements are different. So let's say that Stacy gets up here and she says, I got great news. Assessments are free. And we have created a magical process that Amira has invented that allows the assessments to occur in a millisecond. So not only is it free, it takes no time. Good to go. If you have the requirements implemented, we press a button and it's over with. Does CMMC, in the minds of most people, suddenly become affordable? Is it suddenly not a barrier? Right? Is it suddenly, are all the bad parts of CMMC, have they gone away? Right? Of course not, because the actual cost and burden and impact of CMMC doesn't have anything to do with the CMMC program. It has everything to do with the requirements. So that's a huge bummer, right? Because, you know, obviously we're sort of pulling the Band-Aid off here and exposing what's going on. But remember, these are the references for that sort of summary slide earlier. When you look at the rulemaking process, and maybe some people in this room have said it, or maybe you have friends and family, loved ones that have said it to you, I'm waiting for the rulemaking to conclude before we're actually going to do anything. We're waiting on the rule for an arbitrary amount of time because of comment analyses that have to occur that we can already know what they're going to say. So, on that cheery note, who has questions?
Take your breath, Jacob. Get you a sip of water. All right, online question here. If the estimated size of the supply chain is between 80 and 300,000 companies, and most organizations have not taken this seriously, what do you expect the DoD to do? Waiver everything or allow primes to not have small businesses, etc., if they are not compliant? Question makes sense?
Yeah, no, the question makes sense. So I can tell you, if you take a close read at the regulatory flexibility analysis and all the rules, the DoD does not know how big the DIB is, and they never have, and they probably never will. And so when they estimate the size of the DIB, what typically happens is they are estimating the minimum size of the DIB because they can only estimate what they can see, and they have very limited visibility. So when they say we think 80,000 companies have CUI that should be assessed, that is the minimum amount of companies. And you are correct. There is going to be a squeeze for resources to get assessed. There are going to be winners and losers. And the longer that we stare at this problem, sort of the understanding of how the rules will happen, the only thing that I see is massive consolidation within the defense industrial base as the effect of this regulation, period. Right? The goal of the rule is not to maintain a certain number of small businesses. The goal of the rule is to implement an assessment of pre-existing requirements. And there are trade-offs and costs associated with doing that. And it doesn't appear after the government's internal review that they have moved off of that. Maybe in the middle of 2021, before we knew what the output was, there would be a case where you go, well, maybe they're going to zig instead of zag. They zagged, right? They're zagging straight into massive consolidation. And I don't think that's a surprise to the people who are writing the rules. I think it's maybe a little bit simplistic of an explanation. In fact, Scott, as well as some other folks tomorrow, have a panel specifically talking about the existing amount of consolidation that we're witnessing happening in the DIB right now, right? This isn't a question of like what will happen. It's already happening.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation, Jacob. Good as always. Question about DFAR clauses. Once 7021 comes into play next year and starts showing up in contracts, do you anticipate situations where 7021 will be there as well as 7012? The differences, CUI, CDI, and that kind of, any expansion you can give on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So very common question that comes up all the time. Remember, it's not about the fact that sort of the mistaken idea is that 7021 is replacing 7012. That's not the case. 7012 is what specifies requirements. And then it was amended in 2016 to say if you experience an incident, you got to report it. And if you buy cloud services, it has to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent. So it bolted those on to the side of the requirements. 7021 has nothing to do with those requirements. 7021 says you're being assessed. So they have to coexist. If 7012 somehow got nuked from orbit, then there would be nothing to assess, right? There was no assessment clause. Everyone was self-attesting, and we all know how that worked. So 7012 doesn't really work by itself. So yeah, they necessarily coexist because 7021 is a function of verifying 7012.
All right, question from online here. We have a hard time getting buy-in from leadership. Do you have any recommendations on how to encourage upper management or leadership to make CMMC a priority?
That's the $1 million question, right? I mean, we experience this all the time. We talk to companies every day. And literally, this has turned into a multi-year research project to sort of, I didn't know how rulemaking worked a few years ago, until we sort of learned how it worked and then read the rationale documented. Because before you read the Federal Register and the actual documented why from the government about why these things are happening, you're like, why are they doing this? So if the why from the mouths of the government as documented in the Federal Register is not sufficient to convince business owners that this is real, then you're in a bad situation, right? I mean, these are not editorialized quotes on these slides. These are direct quotes from the Federal Register, which are written by the DoD. And they have said multiple times, right? This is our rationale. They have been very consistent in how they explain it. So I don't know if that was an admin, like an IT security person that's saying, how do I get buy-in from my boss? You might not be able to. And Daniel Akridge, who's giving a presentation tomorrow as well, has the best summary of CMMC I've ever heard. He says, you cannot really be on time with CMMC. You can only be early because you're working on the requirements, or late. And if you're late, how late can you afford to be based off of the market dynamics that'll result?
So you talked about briefly the fact that there was a transition from CMMC 1.0 to CMMC 2.0. CMMC 1.0 had a lot of things in it that weren't in CMMC 2.0. 2.0 is basically a mirror of 800.171, but they had things like the process institutionalization and some more practices and the levels system that are part of CMMC but not 800.171. So do you think that there's a particular reason why they took all of those out? Do you think it's because it's easier to just enforce the existing requirements? Or do you think that there's something more complicated than that going on?
Yes and yes. So they took it out because it's way easier, right? So part of the major elements of the DoD's strategic intent in 2.0 was the alignment of CMMC with the NIST requirements in 800.171. Wow. Right? Wow. You're assessing 171 and you've aligned the text of the rule to point to 171. Amazing, right? Now, the problem is, and this is a separate presentation, the process maturity elements that were added in CMMC 1.0 were really documentation. And Nick Del Rosso got up here earlier and said the NFO controls at the back of 800.171 specify documentation. So we got rid of the new part of CMMC, and DIBCAC got up here and said, if you don't do the documentation, you're probably not passing. So was it really new? By getting rid of the documentation process maturity requirements, did we really get rid of anything? Or was this like the ultimate inadvertent head fake from DoD, just like crossing everybody up, being like, psych, you still got to do it anyways? Now, when it comes down to the analysis, the economic impact of CMMC, since they no longer exist in the program, the DoD gets to take credit for that, right? If you said, oh, it takes time for documentation, time is money, therefore it costs money to do documentation. Well, CMMC doesn't specify the documentation anymore, NIST does. That means that 2.0 is cheaper than 1.0, even though you're still doing the same amount of work. This is like 4D galaxy brain ultra chess, and I don't think the DoD actually intended to do that. It's brilliant, because now we know that when Congress says, what's going on here? Like, what are you doing to make this easier? All the DoD does is like wave the 2.0 flag around and go, it's easier, it's cheaper, look at all the stuff we got rid of. You still got to do it, but that's NIST problem, right?
Another online here one. What do you believe is the average cost burden for a small business, say 50 people, to implement CMMC?
Well, I'll give you, okay, so so I won't give you, there's plenty of professionals from Summit 7 here who could give you a better answer. Talk to them after. I will give you the estimate from, okay, 800-172 is the document that corresponds to the new CMMC level 3. In 1.0 land, there was 4 and 5. The draft version of 172 was known as 800-171B, right? As if that was, I'm glad they changed the name. NIST release, and if anybody finds this, we can post it afterwards, but if anybody finds it, let us know. You can find the RFP, sort of the, or not the RFP, the sort of request for comment that NIST released, asking for feedback on the initial draft of what is now 172. And in that document, it's the only place they've really estimated a price. They said that to build a complete sort of CUI environment would cost companies somewhere between $10,000 to $250,000. And so which is probably right, I would say my 90% confidence rating is it's somewhere between 10 and 250K. But those are NIST's numbers. And you know, by the smiles on some people's faces and the frowns on other people's faces, I think that's probably right.
So before we go to the next question, I want to address that one real quick as well, because this is something that we see all the time. In fact, I'm having a conversation with Amira and some people online as we speak today on LinkedIn about this very specific issue. And this CMMC, this NIST 171 thing, it is a six-figure problem. I don't care if you're 2 people. It is a six-figure problem. Now, how six figures, or are we going to 7 figures? That's going to depend on the size of the organization. But it is a six-figure problem, regardless if you're 2 people. So,
and you know, on that point, right? I work for Scott. Scott's right. But on that point, we even say it casually. CMMC is a 6-figure problem. Is CMMC a 6-figure problem? Are assessments 6? Maybe. Amira, I don't know. Maybe. Right? But is the implementation and remediation of what CMMC is assessing a 6-figure problem? Yes. That's not a CMMC problem. That's a NIST 800-171 problem. Right? Thank you for the comments on the rule. This is a Wendy's, right? You're going to need to submit those comments to NIST. Oh, there we are.
All right, so NIST has been saying for a long time, for FIPS 140-2, that was a regulation or law, right? Mm-hmm. So I even asked NIST himself directly, hey, why do you keep this in 800-171? Well, it's law. So like you, I like reading late at night, going to bed, cuddling up next to regulation.
Yeah.
You know, trying to figure out where this came from, right? So it came from FSMA. I think it was like 1996 was the first one. But the problem is it says, hey, NIST, go make a standard, right? And that's, from what I'm reading so far, that's what they're stating. So it all relies back on NIST. So if I'm hearing you right in your presentation, it's not DOD.
Yeah.
It's NIST is the problem, right?
Yep.
In regards
well, okay.
to
I'm not going to say it's a problem until, let's hear Victoria. Let's hear her out first before we say it's a problem, but it's a problem.
Okay, the 800-171 is the concern, right? So same thing, DOD says, or government says, hey, you need to create a standard. So they create a standard. Behind doors, there's an anticipation, or we think that they were working with DOD, right? We don't know what those conversations look like or what occurred.
Yeah.
So how do we respond to actually change that standard? So, but I think part of that response and how we do change the standard is we have to have some common similarities in regards to what we want that to look like. So if the majority of the contractors come back and state, hey, we believe this is the right change, and we can actually sign something saying, look, this is what it really should look like, then I think we could actually provide some headway in regards.
Yeah.
So what do you think that's...
Well, so I'll quote you directly from the text of the 2016 rule under the regulatory flexibility analysis. I think it's like page 77. And they say several respondents, somebody tell me if this is the right one. They say several respondents suggested the following things: that small businesses should have a different set of requirements, that small businesses should have a waiver from the requirements. They suggest all of these things. Comments as complaints don't influence anything. So the recommendation is always give us your suggestions, right? Well, we already gave them the suggestions, and the response that they give is, we dismissed all these suggestions for the following reasons, blah, 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 right? You can actually find that. I think it's one of the cited sources at the references slide at the back. So you are correct. The proper way to influence this process is by providing good suggestions. And I would challenge you to go read the suggestions that have already been submitted and then subsequently dismissed and justified in order to maybe save yourself some time. In that, if you submit the same suggestion again on this rule or to NIST, and they've already had it and responded, we know what the answer is. So either we are not giving them the right suggestion or they're not changing their mind. I personally, at this point, after having read so much of it and sort of hearing the pattern of their description, I think that the idea that they are going to significantly change these requirements is probably a pipe dream at this point, right? I mean, we have been talking about this for a long time, about what if this, what if that, what if they change this? They haven't changed it. They've actually accelerated it in terms of the amount of rulemaking they're doing afterwards. I don't know if there is a solution here as a suggestion. Stephanie, did you raise your hand? Sorry, did I skip the order? Sorry.
You messed it all up, Jacob. Hold on.
Stephanie Sigmund, everybody, speaker tomorrow.
Today at 2
Oh,
o'clock.
no, today, after lunch. It's very early on the West Coast, sorry.
So my comment was with regards to the 2013 DFARS 7012. And this is what I expect you're going to hear from DOD if we were to talk further about this issue. And it's related to a government filing in the Aerojet case. And it's because initially, in the 2013 DFARS 7012, the contractors were required to comply with 800-53, which had 263 controls. And they would argue that they made it easier when they revised it in 2015.
A reduction of 30%.
Exactly, to 110 controls that are far more flexible.
That's right.
And so my question to you is, was there, when they decided on this, that rule, 853, and that they were going to incorporate that into the 2013 DFARS 7012, how much pushback was there from industry at that point?
It's funny, if you read the comments that are submitted to the 2013 rule, when the DoD selected their baseline of 853 controls, the main comment that gets submitted is, these aren't risk-based. Right? How many times have we heard that sort of levied against 171? It wasn't that there was less pushback because there were fewer people that sort of knew that it was happening. It was that it was the same pushback that we see in 2016 and currently in 2020. Same criticisms for 53 controls as for 171, although you are correct. The further you pull the camera back, the longer the extensions are, the longer the involuntary extensions are. If you think back to the idea that the original requirements were started in 2013, unless every company in the DIB is less than 10 years old, right? The DoD has given us a decade, even after refining the original requirements down, allegedly, by 30%, right?
As a contractor who has to flow down these rules to our suppliers, it's very, most of our supply chain is never going to get to that point for a long time. So the simplistic is to reduce the amount of CUI data that goes out. So as a supplier or as a contractor, trying to understand the rule about what we can redact that makes the CUI data not CUI data, so we can send it out and yet them be able to do their work to clarify. It seems to me that there's a very difficult and unclear path of what that is. And that simply takes out a lot of the supply chain if we can manage to do that.
Yeah, I think that that's probably the most common suggestion, and it's correct. If you sort of look at this complicated system of requirements and data flows and actors and things like that, there are certain leverage points over the system that would be the most effective, right? Regulating managed service providers rather than contractors and sort of expecting them to do it individually and organically on their own, and then limiting the amount of CUI that's flowed into the industrial base to the primes, and then subsequently from the primes to the subs. Tomorrow, like I said, we have a former contract officer. Very interesting insight when I spoke with her several months ago about her perspective on the DoD's altruism when it comes to minimizing the flow of CUI. I would say that the best example of this is to look at the classified information program. For decades, the government has been plagued by a lack of incentives to classify appropriately and a lack of disincentives for overclassifying. What that means is that the behavior that is incentivized in the system is just classify everything. And they've struggled and struggled and struggled to get people to stop doing that. But you don't get in trouble if you do it. You do get in trouble if you don't do it. Now we have that in spades, but for unclassified information. Is the DoD or a contract officer or a purchaser at a major prime going to get in trouble if they categorize something as CUI? No. Are they going to get in trouble if they don't? Yeah, because the entire reason we're assessing these requirements is that the NDA directed the DoD to create a standard and make sure that this is happening. So you are correct that the best leverage point over the system is to minimize that flow of CUI, but it is such a distributed and complex system of behaviors and incentives and disincentives, lack of incentives, that I just don't know if the DoD has a lever that they can pull. Stacy's mentioned it before, that she's writing a desk guide for contract officers and program managers to like better navigate CUI. We should ask her about it tomorrow. Personally, I don't have a lot of faith that that's going to fix the problem. I think instead what's going to happen is you're going to see an increase in the amount of CUI because the department is mitigating their risk, so they over-categorize. Primes are mitigating their risk, so they over-categorize. They flow down, they flow down, they flow down. And then, unfortunately, you get trapped because now you are in the middle of this system where you can no longer flow these requirements without crushing your sub-suppliers. And that does not appear to be a new issue that they are unaware of, which is why part of the panel that we have tomorrow is specifically discussing the aggressive consolidation in the DIB that we're already seeing. So I know that's bad news and not a good answer. You are right, but I don't know if it's going to help. And now it's lunchtime.
All right. Give it up, Jacob.